I still had my husband's funeral dirt under my fingernails when his mother, Catherine, slapped the house keys out of my hand. "You were a mistake he made while he was alive," she sneered. "One we are correcting now that he's dead." Behind her, the Westbrook men stood like cold statues as my bags were tossed into the mud. I was Zara Westbrook, once a wife loved beyond measure, now a black widow left to die in the rain with nothing but a garbage bag and $0 to my name. I thought the darkness would swallow me, until the headlights of a black Genesis cut through the storm. I didn't know then that the man behind the wheel was Kim Min-yi, a man whose name made the city tremble. He didn't just give me a ride, he gave me a war. If you're ready to see what happens when an evil family loses everything to a woman with nothing left to lose, hit that subscribe button. Let's get into my story. Before the rain turned to ice and my life turned to ash, there was a season of light so brilliant it felt untouchable. My husband, David Westbrook, was the only man I'd ever met who looked at me and saw a sanctuary rather than a trophy or a target. We lived in a world of our own making, a beautiful, isolated island of joy and happiness that we guarded with fierce devotion. While the Westbrook name carried the heavy scent of old money, power, and corporate greed, David had built a wall around our home that their venom couldn't penetrate. He was my shield, my best friend, and the only person who made this foreign land feel like home. Our days were filled with the kind of quiet magic that doesn't need an audience. We didn't bother with the extended family's gala invitations or their suffocating Sunday brunches, preferring the warmth of our own kitchen and the sound of our shared laughter. David knew the whispers that followed me, the hushed, ugly comments about my skin tone and my heritage that his mother, Catherine, barely bothered to hide behind her designer silk scarves. He knew his father, Richard, viewed our marriage as a stain on the family's carefully curated legacy. Yet David never wavered. He would take my hand in public, his grip firm and steady, and lean in to whisper, "It's just you and me, Zara, always." He shielded me from the racism that lived in their hearts and the greed that fueled their lives. He was the one who told me that our success was ours alone, built on the long hours we both poured into our joint ventures. We labored side by side to build a life that didn't rely on the Westbrook coffers, creating a portfolio of properties and investments that were supposed to be our future. In those years, I was the luckiest woman alive, living in a golden cage that didn't feel like a prison, because the doors were only locked to keep the monsters out. But monsters are patient, and they know how to wait for the shield to fall. It happened on a Tuesday, a day that started with a kiss and ended with a phone call that shattered the universe. The motor accident was described as ghastly, a word too clinical for the horror of a twisted metal frame and a life extinguished in a heartbeat on a rain-slicked highway. Just like that, the wall David had built around me vanished. The grief was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that left me numb as I moved through the motions of a funeral I barely remember. I stood by the grave, my heart buried with him, unaware that the people standing behind me weren't mourning a son. They were calculating the value of his estate. The betrayal didn't wait for the mourning period to end. It didn't even wait for the sun to set on the day of his burial. I returned from the cemetery, my shoes still caked with the fresh earth of his final resting place, only to find the locks changed and my belongings piled in the mud. There was no mercy in Catherine's eyes as she watched me struggle to understand. There was no grief in Richard's voice when he told me that without David, I was nothing to them. They had waited until the dirt was fresh on his grave to strike, working together to cast me out into the heavy rain. As the gates of the life I had built slammed shut, I realized the bitter truth. The family I had tried so hard to love had never been my family at all. I was standing in the downpour, a widow with nothing left but the clothes on my back and a heart full of ruins, while the Westbrooks laughed from the dry safety of the home they had stolen. The rain didn't stop, and neither did the cold. For 3 days, I was a ghost haunting the streets of a city that had once been my playground. Every step was a battle against the exhaustion that threatened to pull me into the pavement. My designer clothes, once a symbol of my status, were now nothing more than damp, heavy rags clinging to a body that had forgotten the warmth of a meal or the comfort of a bed. I had wandered until my feet were numb, driven by a hollow hope that the universe would offer some reprieve, but the universe remained as indifferent as the Westbrooks. I was alone in a sea of millions, a black widow waiting for the end. The end nearly came in a blur of headlights and the screech of tires. I remember the sudden, blinding glare cutting through the midnight fog, a black shape looming over me like a predator. My legs, finally surrendering to the weight of my grief and hunger, simply gave out. I didn't feel the impact, only the cold embrace of the wet asphalt and the distant, muffled sound of a heavy car door opening before the darkness claimed me entirely. When the world finally returned, it didn't come back in shadows and rain. It came back in the scent of antiseptic and expensive linen. I woke up in a room that felt more like a royal sanctuary than a hospital suite. The walls were a soft, muted cream, and the sheets beneath me were pure silk, a sharp contrast to the grit of the gutters I had occupied just hours before. My body felt heavy, tethered to an IV drip that hummed quietly in the corner, pumping life back into my exhausted veins. For a moment, I thought I had died and been transported to a better version of my old life, until I saw the door. Standing at the entrance were two men, their presence shattering the illusion of a peaceful recovery. They weren't doctors or orderlies. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in sharp black suits that screamed of a specific kind of professional violence. Their faces were masks of iron, their eyes scanning the hallway with a military precision that made my breath hitch. This wasn't a public hospital. This was a fortress. "You're awake," a voice said, cutting through the silence like silk over steel. I turned my head slowly, and there he was. He was sitting in a high-backed chair in the corner of the room, a tablet in his hand, and a look of calculated intensity in his dark eyes. He was younger than I expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with a jawline that looked carved from granite and a presence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He wore a tailored black suit with the collar of his white shirt unbuttoned, exuding an aura of understated luxury and absolute authority. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves. "You're in a private facility under my protection," he replied, standing up with a grace that felt predatory. He walked toward the bed, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He looked down at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a furrow of concern in his expression before it was replaced by a cold, businesslike mask. "My driver nearly turned you into a permanent fixture of the road. I decided to take responsibility for your recovery instead." "Who are you?" I asked, my hand trembling as I clutched the silk sheet. I looked for a business card, a hospital ID, anything that suggested he was a man of the law or a corporate executive. A small, dangerous smile touched his lips. "My name is Kim Min-yi. To some, I am an investor. To others, I am a problem they cannot solve." The name hit me like a physical blow. Even in the sheltered world David had built for me, I had heard the whispers of Kim Min-yi. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the king of Seoul, the most feared mafia boss in the underworld, a man whose influence reached into the highest offices and the darkest corners of the city. I looked at the armed men at the door and then back at the man standing over me. The realization settled in my gut with the weight of lead. I hadn't been saved by a good Samaritan. I had been picked up by the most dangerous man in the country, and I had just traded one cage for a much more lethal one. I was in a silk prison, and the key belonged to a ghost. The antiseptic scent of the suite felt heavier now, mingling with the expensive, woody cologne that clung to Kim Min-yi. He sat at the foot of my bed, a silent observer as I began to unravel the wreckage of my life. I told him everything, not just the facts, but the feeling of it. I described the 3 years David, and I had spent building our world brick by brick, the long nights of labor, and the shared dreams that the Westbrooks had viewed as a contagion. I told him how they had waited for the dirt to settle on David's casket before they stripped the wedding ring from my memory and the keys from my hand. As I spoke, I watched the man they called the King of Seoul. His expression remained a mask of polished stone, but his eyes, dark and bottomless, began to change. I told him about Catherine's sneer as she threw my bags into the mud, and Richard's cold declaration that I was nothing more than a curse they were finally correcting. I spoke of the 3 days I had spent wandering in the rain, a ghost in my own city, while they sat in the warmth of the home David and I had paid for with our own sweat. When I finally finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Min-yi didn't move, but the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thin, charged with a sudden violent static. His calm, calculated demeanor didn't just crack. It vanished, replaced by a white-hot fury that seemed to vibrate off his tailored suit. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the silk sheets like a dark omen. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking through the walls toward the Westbrook estate. "They took your labor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that made the guards at the door straighten their backs. "They took your mourning and turned it into an opportunity for theft. They treated the widow of their own son like a stray dog to be kicked into the gutter." He turned back to me, and for the first time, the intimidating authority in his gaze was tempered by a terrifying kind of respect. He reached out, his thumb brushing against my jaw where the cold of the rain still seemed to linger in my bones. "In my world, there is a price for such dishonor," he whispered, his eyes burning with a draconic fire. "The Westbrooks believe they have won because they hold the paper and the keys. They do not realize they have invited a war they cannot survive." He stepped away from the bed, the fury now refined into a cold, sharp blade of intent. He adjusted his cuffs, the silver ring on his finger catching the light like a spark of ice. "Zara," he said, using my name with a weight that felt like a coronation. "I give you my word. They will pay for every tear that fell in that rain. They will pay for every cent they stole and every insult they spat. I will ensure they return what is yours, and they will pay the interest in blood or in gold." The vow hung in the air, a dark promise from a man who didn't know the meaning of mercy. I looked at my trembling hands and then at him. For the first time since the accident, the hollow pit of my grief was being filled with something else. It was hot, sharp, and tasted like justice. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a catalyst for a dragon's wrath. The transition from the sterile luxury of the hospital to Kim Min-yee's private estate felt like crossing a border into a sovereign nation. His home was a fortress of glass and charcoal stone perched high above the city, where the air was thin and the silence was heavy with the weight of unspoken commands. It was here, amidst the minimalist elegance and the watchful eyes of silent guards, that my second life truly began. Min-yee didn't treat me like a guest or a fragile survivor. He treated me like a dormant weapon that needed to be sharpened. The first lesson began in his study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling screens that flickered with the digital pulse of the city. He stood by the window, the sprawling lights of Seoul reflecting in his dark, intense eyes. "The Westbrooks believe they are powerful because they have a high bank balance and a name that opens doors," he said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum that commanded attention. "But they are fools. Money can be frozen. Names can be tarnished. Real power, Zara, isn't just money, it's information." Over the following weeks, the softness that had defined my life as a sheltered wife was methodically stripped away. Min-yee became a relentless mentor, pushing me to shed the skin of the woman who had begged for mercy in the rain. He taught me that every human being has a pressure point, a secret, a debt, or a desire that can be used to bend them to your will. We spent hours dissecting the Westbrook empire, not looking for their assets, but for their fractures. He showed me how to read a balance sheet not for profit, but for the hidden gaps where Richard Westbrook's embezzlement lay hidden like a coiled snake. He taught me the art of leverage, how to find the one piece of information a man would kill to protect and use it to make him move like a puppet on a string. Under his guidance, I realized that my late husband's family hadn't just stolen my property. They had relied on my ignorance of the world they lived in. "You have been playing a game of emotions," Min-yee told me one evening as we pored over a list of the brother Luke's secret creditors. "The Westbrooks used your love for David to blind you. Now you will use their greed to bury them. Information is the knife. Leverage is the hand that twists it." I learned to mask my grief behind a calculated, icy silence. I learned to watch the subtle shifts in a person's posture, to hear the lie before it was fully spoken. Each secret we uncovered, every unpaid debt of Luke's, every cold-blooded transaction of Catherine's, became a brick in the wall I was building to crush them. I was no longer the widow wandering in the rain. I was becoming a predator in the shadows, learning that while the Westbrooks owned the streets, Min-yee owned the truth, and soon that truth would be mine to unleash. The Westbrook family's arrogance was a terminal disease, and Luke Westbrook was the primary carrier. He had always been the golden boy of their twisted dynasty, a man who believed that the world was merely a collection of things he hadn't yet decided to own. To him, I was just another one of those things, a temporary inconvenience that had been successfully discarded. But entitlement makes men blind, and Luke was too blinded by his own reflection to notice that the woman he had kicked into the mud was no longer there. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks since I had moved into Kim Min-yee's estate. I was standing on the terrace, watching the fog roll over the Han River, when a familiar, aggressive roar of an engine echoed up the private winding road. I didn't need to see the car to know it was him. Luke drove his slate-gray Porsche like he lived his life, with zero regard for the safety of others and an absolute expectation of being let through. He expected to find a dilapidated apartment or a cheap motel where I would be cowering in fear, perhaps ready to sign away the final life insurance documents in exchange for a few $1,000s. Instead, his car came to a screeching halt in front of the massive, charcoal stone gates of the Minyi fortress. I watched from the balcony, invisible behind the smoked glass, as Luke stepped out of his car. He looked exactly as he always did, cocky, with a tailored suit jacket thrown over his shoulders and a smirk that suggested he was the protagonist of every room he entered. He walked up to the intercom with a casual air of authority, likely preparing some cutting remark about my new gutter. But the gates didn't open. Instead, the small side door clicked, and 4 men stepped out. These weren't the security guards Luke was used to at his country club. These were Minyi's elite enforcers. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of predators, their black suits perfectly fitted over frames that suggested a lifetime of violence. They didn't speak. They simply formed a wall of living stone between Luke and the entrance. Luke's smirk faltered, his piercing blue eyes widening as he took in the sheer scale of the estate behind them and the caliber of the men standing in his way. He tried to reclaim his bravado, stepping forward and flashing a finger as if he were scolding a waiter. "I'm looking for Zara. Tell her to get out here. She's got family business to settle, and she's wasting my time." The lead enforcer, a man whose jaw looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the gate, didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "There is no Zara here," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "There is only Mrs. Westbrook, and she does not wish to be disturbed by trespassers." "Trespassers?" Luke laughed, though the sound was high-pitched and strained. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm a Westbrook. My father owns half the commercial real estate in this district. Move aside before I have this entire place shuttered." The enforcer took a single step forward, and the air around Luke seemed to turn to ice. "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Westbrook. We also know about your offshore gambling debts in Macau. We know about the $3 million you borrowed from your father's development fund to cover your losses. And most importantly, we know that if you don't get back in your car in the next 10 seconds, you will find out what happens when a Westbrook meets the King of Soul." The name hit Luke like a physical blow to the stomach. The King of Soul was a myth to people like him, a dark story told to keep the elite from stepping too far out of line. To realize that the widow he had mocked was now under the direct protection of Kim Minyi was a paradigm shift he wasn't prepared for. I watched as the first wave of genuine panic washed over his face. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, and the hand he had been using to point at the guards began to tremble. He looked up at the house, his eyes darting across the windows until they landed on the glass where I stood. He couldn't see me, but he felt me. He felt the shift in power. He felt the cold realization that the Black Widow was no longer a victim to be bullied, but a woman who was now completely, terrifyingly untouchable. Without another word, Luke scrambled back into his Porsche. He didn't turn the car around with his usual flair. He fumbled with the ignition, his tires chirping as he sped away from the gates as if the devil himself were chasing him. I stepped away from the window, my heart racing not with fear, but with a cold, sharp satisfaction. The training Minyi had given me was working. Information was indeed the ultimate weapon. Luke had come to deliver a threat, but he had left carrying a death sentence for his family's peace of mind. The war had officially moved from the gutters to their front door. The following Monday, the sky over Seoul was a bruised purple, the kind of heavy atmosphere that precedes a total collapse. Inside the command center of Kim Minyi's estate, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and expensive espresso. Minyi stood behind me, his hands resting lightly on the back of my chair, as he signaled his legal and less legal teams to begin. For weeks, we had been the hunters in the tall grass. Now it was time to bite. "Revenge is a dish best served through 1,000 paper cuts," Minyi whispered, his voice dark and melodic. "Watch closely, Zara. This is how you dismantle a dynasty without firing a single bullet." The first strike was surgical. Minyi's legal team, a group of elite attorneys who operated in the gray space where the law bends but doesn't break, filed a series of emergency injunctions. We targeted the Westbrook's primary holding company, citing the fraudulent transfer of assets that had occurred immediately following David's death. Because Minyi's influence reached into the mahogany offices of the city's top auditors, the injunctions weren't just filed, they were fast-tracked. By 10:00 a.m., the Westbrook family's corporate bank accounts were frozen, pending investigation. I watched the live data feeds on the monitors. Richard Westbrook's face flashed on a news snippet as he was cornered leaving his office, looking bewildered and several years older. He didn't know yet that the freeze was only the beginning. While the lawyers tied their hands in court, Minyi's, less legal, teams moved into the streets. The Westbrooks' import-export business was the backbone of their liquid wealth. Minyi made 3 phone calls to the shipping docks and the customs officials who lived in his pocket. Suddenly, Westbrook shipments were flagged for irregularities. Containers filled with high-end textiles and luxury goods were left to rot in the sun, held under indefinite inspection. Their logistics chain, once a well-oiled machine of old money influence, ground to a screeching halt. The silence from the docks was a death knell for Richard's quarterly projections. But the most satisfying part of the raid wasn't the corporate collapse. It was the reclamation of the physical world David and I had built. One by one, the properties we had labored for began to return to me. The boutique hotel in Myeongdong, the commercial plaza in Gangnam, and the seaside villa we had designed as our retirement sanctuary. All of them had been illegally absorbed by the Westbrook estate through forged documents and coerced signatures. Minyi's hackers had spent nights recovering the deleted digital trails of those forgeries, and his enforcers had spent days convincing the crooked notaries who had helped the Westbrooks to confess their sins. By noon, the legal tide had turned so violently that the deeds were being reissued in my name. I watched on a tablet as a group of Minyi's men arrived at the Gangnam Plaza. They didn't come with guns, they came with a court order and a locksmith. They walked into the management office, and for the first time in my life, I saw the Westbrook name being literally scraped off the glass. "It's happening," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of grief and triumph. "They're losing it all." "They are losing the things they stole," Minyi corrected, stepping around to look me in the eye. His expression was calm, but there was a predatory spark of pride in his gaze. "You are simply taking back the ground you already stood on. But look at the screens, Zara. Look at their faces." A private security feed from the Westbrook mansion showed the chaos within. Catherine was packing the foyer, her elegant composure shattered as she screamed into a telephone. Richard sat at the mahogany table, his head in his hands, surrounded by a mountain of legal notices. They looked like small, frightened people trapped in a house that was no longer a home. "They thought they could bury you in the rain," Minyi said, his hand moving to cover mine. "Now they are the ones who cannot find a dry place to stand. Every cent they took from you is currently being siphoned into a trust they cannot touch. Every property you bled for is back under your feet." As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, the final notification popped up on my screen. The Westbrook family estate itself was now under a lien. The very roof they had used to shelter their cruelty was being pulled out from over them. I felt a weight lift from my chest, not the weight of the grief, for David was still gone, but the weight of the injustice. The Black Widow had stopped mourning and started ruling. The properties were back, the money was flowing toward the right hands, and the Westbrooks were finally discovering what it felt like to be cold, hungry, and unwanted. The raid was a success, but as Minyi's dark eyes met mine, I knew the true reckoning was still to come at the gala. The Grand Crystal Ballroom was a cathedral of glass, gold, and cold pretension, a place where Seoul's elite gathered to trade favors and mask their sins behind champagne flutes. Tonight was supposed to be the Westbrooks' triumphant return to grace, a desperate display of wealth intended to signal to their investors that the recent legal hiccups were nothing more than a misunderstanding. Richard and Catherine stood at the center of the room, draped in the armor of old money, their smiles as brittle as dried bone. They had no idea that the woman they had left to rot in the mud was currently waiting in the wings, ready to burn their stage to the ground. The heavy oak doors swung open not with a bang, but with a silent, heavy authority that pulled the oxygen from the room. A hush rippled through the crowd as I stepped onto the marble floor. I was no longer the shivering girl in a soaked white shirt. I was draped in a custom midnight silk gown that flowed around me like spilled ink, cinched at the waist by a belt of dark diamonds. My skin, once pale from exhaustion, glowed with a terrifying vitality under the chandeliers. At my side, Kim Min-yi walked with the predatory grace of a king, his presence alone causing the room's power dynamic to tilt violently. He didn't just escort me. He presented me as the apex of the room's hierarchy. I saw the moment Catherine spotted me. Her champagne glass tilted dangerously, her face turning the color of ash. Beside her, Richard's jaw dropped, his old money composure fracturing like cheap porcelain. They tried to turn away, to retreat into the safety of their circle, but Min-yi's men had already subtly shifted, closing off the exits with polite, ironclad efficiency. "Richard, Catherine," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that silenced the last of the orchestra. I didn't scream. I didn't need to. The quietest sounds are often the most lethal. As the elite of soul turned their heads, I began to walk toward them, the rhythmic click of my heels sounding like a countdown. "I noticed you're still hosting parties in a house you no longer own, with money that belongs to a widow you left for dead." "Zara, don't be absurd," Catherine hissed, her voice trembling as she tried to maintain her mask of disdain. "This is a private event. You're making a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Catherine. I'm making a record," I replied, stopping inches from her. I pulled a slim, black folder from the clutch I carried. "The auditors found the forged signatures, Richard. They found the offshore accounts you used to hide David's life insurance. And tonight, the city's ethics committee found out that you've been using investor funds to cover Luke's gambling debts." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. To the people in this room, losing money was a tragedy, but losing face was a death sentence. I watched as their friends, the CEOs and socialites who had been laughing with them moments ago, began to physically step away, creating a circle of isolation around the Westbrooks. "You called me a black widow to shame me," I said, leaning in so only they could hear the ice in my words. "You thought that name would make me small, but a black widow doesn't just mourn, she survives the world that tries to crush her, and she always takes what is hers." I turned to the room, my gaze sweeping over the cameras and the curious eyes of the city's most powerful. "As of 6 o'clock tonight, the Westbrook holdings have been liquidated. The properties they stole have been returned to my name, and the people you see before you are no longer the Westbrooks you knew. They are simply ghosts in expensive suits." Richard tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as the reality of his social annihilation set in. He looked around and saw only cold stares and the flash of smartphones recording his downfall. Catherine let out a soft, strangled sob, her hand reaching for a necklace that was likely already under a lien. Min-yi stepped forward, placing a hand on the small of my back. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave the room made it clear. Zara Westbrook was now a name protected by the dragon. We turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the Westbrooks standing in the center of a ruins they had built themselves. Behind us, the Black Widow was no longer a slur or a curse. It was a title of power, a warning that the woman they tried to bury had instead taken the throne. The social ruin was complete. The legal end was only a signature away. The aftermath of the gala was not a celebration. It was a clinical extraction. Within 24 hours, the Westbrook name had become radioactive, and the family's remaining allies had vanished like smoke in a gale. The final act of their downfall took place not in a grand ballroom, but in the sterile, high-ceilinged conference room of Kim Min-yi's private offices. The view outside the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a gray, overcast Seoul, mirroring the bleak reality now facing the people who had once thought themselves untouchable. I sat at the head of the long obsidian table, Min-yi standing directly behind me like a shadow made of steel. Across from us sat Richard, Catherine, and Luke. They looked like hollowed-out versions of the people who had stood on that mansion porch weeks ago. Richard's expensive suit seemed 2 sizes too large for his shrunken frame. Catherine's eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with a desperation that no amount of designer makeup could hide. And Luke, the once arrogant prince, sat slumped and trembling, his cocky bravado replaced by the twitching nerves of a man who knew he was one word away from a prison cell. On the table between us lay the final document, the deed to the Westbrook family estate. It was the crown jewel of their stolen empire, the very roof they had used as a weapon against me. Beside it sat a fountain pen that looked more like a ceremonial dagger in the harsh fluorescent light. "You can't do this," Catherine whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the paper. "That house has been in the family for 3 generations. It's our legacy." "Your legacy died the moment you used it to shelter the theft of a widow's life," I replied, my voice calm and devoid of the pity they were fishing for. "You didn't value David's legacy when he was alive, and you certainly didn't value it when you threw my clothes into the mud. Why should I value yours?" Minyi leaned forward, his hands pressing flat onto the table. The movement was slight, but the guards at the door shifted in response, a silent reminder of the less legal consequences waiting for them if this meeting didn't end in my favor. "The investigation into your embezzlement is ready to be handed over to the prosecutor's office," Minyi said, his tone conversational but lethal. "The Macau gambling debts Luke accumulated have been bought by my associates. Right now, you owe the underworld more than you owe the banks. Sign the deed over to Zara and the criminal charges disappear. The debts are erased. You walk away with your freedom, but nothing else." Richard looked at the pen, then at me. For a moment, I saw a flash of the old patriarch, the man who thought he could dominate anyone through sheer force of will. But as he looked into Minyi's dark, unblinking eyes, that spark went out. He realized he wasn't negotiating. He was being offered a mercy he didn't deserve. With a hand that shook visibly, Richard reached for the pen. I watched in silence as he scrawled his name on the line, the final signature that severed the Westbrook name from the land they had occupied. Catherine followed, her tears smudging the ink as she signed away the only thing she had left to give her status. Finally, Luke signed, his eyes downcast, unable to look at me even for a second. I picked up the document, the parchment feeling heavy with the weight of the last few months. I felt no surge of joy, only a profound sense of equilibrium. The scales were finally balanced. "The gates will be locked at sunset," I said, standing up. "My team has already packed your personal belongings, just the things you brought into that house themselves, nothing bought with David's money or mine. You'll find them in garbage bags at the edge of the driveway." The irony wasn't lost on them. Catherine let out a strangled sob, realizing I was mirroring her own cruelty back at her with mathematical precision. "Where are we supposed to go?" Luke asked, his voice small and pathetic. "The same place you sent me," I told him, looking him straight in the eyes. "Into the rain. I suggest you start walking before it starts to pour." As they were escorted out by Minyi's men, I walked to the window and watched them descend the stairs to the street. They looked small, fragile, and utterly broken. 3 people who had built their lives on the suffering of others, now discovering that when the money and the name are stripped away, there is nothing left underneath. I stood in the warmth of the office, the deed to my future held firmly in my hand, watching the Westbrooks disappear into the gray city, finally knowing exactly what it felt like to have nothing left to lose. The Westbrook estate, once a monument to the family's cruelty, was silent as I walked through its vaulted halls for the last time as a visitor. The scent of David's favorite sandalwood still lingered in the library, but it no longer pulled at my chest with the same agonizing weight. The justice we had exacted hadn't brought him back, but it had cleared the path for a future where his name, and mine, would never again be used as a footnote to someone else's greed. Outside, the gray clouds had finally broken, giving way to a dusk of deep violets and burning oranges. Kim Minyi was waiting for me on the marble terrace, his back to the house as he looked out over the sprawling skyline of Seoul. He was framed by the city he commanded, a man of shadows who had nonetheless become my greatest source of light. As I approached, he turned, his intense dark eyes softening in a way he saved only for me. "The news just broke," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration in the evening air. "Richard and Catherine were taken into custody an hour ago. The evidence of the insurance fraud and the embezzled investor funds was more than enough. And Luke, well, his gambling creditors were waiting at the station to ensure he didn't post bail." I leaned against the stone balustrade, watching the lights of the city flicker to life. The Westbrooks were gone. The people who had tried to bury me in the rain were now facing a life of concrete walls and iron bars, their reputation shattered beyond repair. But even with the victory complete, There was a question hanging in the air, one that had been growing between us with every lesson and every secret shared. Minyi stepped closer, his presence commanding and yet strangely vulnerable. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that contradicted the lethal power he held over the city. "You have reclaimed everything that was taken, Zara," he whispered. "You are the legal owner of an empire, a woman of wealth and influence. You could leave this world behind. You could take your fortune and find a life of peace, far away from the shadows I inhabit." He paused, his gaze searching mine. "But I don't think that's who you are anymore. I've watched you transform. I've seen the fire you carry. Seoul needs a queen who understands the value of loyalty because she has known the cost of betrayal." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. When he opened it, a ring of rare black diamonds surrounding a single, flawless white stone caught the fading sunlight. It wasn't just a promise of marriage, it was a pact. "Stay with me," Minyi said, his voice dropping to a silken, ironclad vow. "Not as a guest and not as a student. Rule with me. Be the partner to the King of Seoul. Together, we will build a new empire, one that values the labor of the honest and punishes the greed of the cruel. I am asking you to be my wife and my equal." I looked at the ring, then at the man who had pulled me from the gutter and taught me how to sharpen my grief into a blade. The Zara who had fainted in the rain was dead. The woman standing on this terrace was someone David would have been proud of, someone who had survived the unthinkable and emerged with a crown. "I didn't think I could ever trust a man again," I said, my hand moving to rest over his heart. "But you didn't just save my life, Minyi. You gave me back my soul." I took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger. It felt heavy, a beautiful anchor to a new reality. "I accept, but I won't just rule by your side. I will rule with you." A rare, genuine smile broke across Minyi's face, a look of absolute triumph. He pulled me into his arms, and as he kissed me, the last of the Black Widow's mourning faded into the night. 6 months later, the headlines no longer spoke of a scandalous widow or a fallen dynasty. They spoke of the new power couple of the underworld, the King and Queen of Seoul. The Westbrook properties had been transformed into centers for social advocacy and legitimate business, funded by the very wealth the family had tried to hoard. As I stood at the window of our new penthouse, looking down at the rain-slicked streets where I had once wandered lost and alone, I realized that I wasn't just a survivor. I was the architect of my own fate. The Westbrooks were a memory rotting in a prison cell, but Zara Westbrook was a name that made the city bow. My story was no longer a tragedy, it was a reign. Drop a comment with Team ZARA if you believe justice is a dish best served with a Mafia king by your side. Until next time, remember, never mistake a woman's silence for her weakness. Goodbye, loves.